Hi, my name's Jordan Marshall and I'm Special Projects Editor at Building, and I'm really excited to be welcoming you all to our second panel discussion of the day, The Rise of Flexible Working in Construction. It's all part of our digital building series. I'd love to first of all introduce our speakers for today. We've got Angus Duggard, Commercial Director at HKS, and Alice Jennison, Inclusion and Diversity Manager at Skanska. From my perspective, obviously this is a really important topic. There's been a lot of movement in this area for construction over the past 2 years, 18 months, and it does vary right across the supply chain. So I'm really grateful for the perspectives that our panelists are able to provide today. Few housekeeping matters. The way it's going to go, soon I'll stop talking and you'll hear from the people who have the interesting things to say. Please send through your questions at any time because we really want to include as much audience interaction as possible. And we'll try and cover as many of those off as we can. Then each of Alice and Angus is going to outline some of their key points on the topic before we all come back together for a Q&A session, group conversation. Also, this session plus all our sessions from Digital Building Series today will be available on demand. The other two already are. This will be within about 60 minutes of us wrapping up. Same link you've joined with today. So if you really enjoyed it, want to revisit anything, or want to pass on to a colleague or someone else who you think will enjoy, please feel free to do that. It will be available free for 12 months on demand. That's probably enough from me to start things off. So I think Alice is going to be kicking things off for us. So I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Jordan. My name is Alice Jennison, and I'm the Inclusion and Diversity Manager for Skanska UK. We are a Swedish contractor working in the UK, across the UK. We're a principal contractor, and we've built things like the Gherkin in London, been part of the M25 widening, hospitals and schools across the UK as well too. For me personally, I actually started my career with Skanska in our environment team, working with sustainability, and I've worked in Stockholm and Norway in the US with our social sustainability strategy. And I've spent the last 5 years prior to this role working as the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion lead on a part of our joint venture on High Speed 2. Flexible working was really key to that strategy. So I come at this flexible working webinar from an angle of employee attraction, retention and engagement, but also really specifically how flexible working can unlock the ability of the construction industry to attract and retain a more diverse workforce, and to help people feel more included at work, to be able to do their best at work too, which is an important productivity gain needed by the construction industry too. I've been in this position with Skanska UK for a couple of months now, and I'm going to draw upon some of my experience from High Speed 2 and also my experience in this position too. And there's two main case studies that I'll be referring from. One is we actually ran on the High Speed 2 project a flexible working trial pre-COVID. So I come at this from an angle that a lot of what we hear around flexible working in the press and in the construction industry is very specific to people working in offices. That is a huge. We really need to ensure that the benefits of flexible working are felt equally by our workforce where it's possible on site. And obviously you can't dig a hole working from home, and typically sites have very specific and rigid working hours that they're working to. So flexible working is a little bit more complex in that environment. And something I wanted to draw upon is thinking about how we can make flexible working happen on site. And one of the questions I always get asked is, yeah, we're too busy to consider this. You know, we really have to focus on cost and program and quality and health and safety and environment, and flexible working comes at the bottom of that list, really. And I argue and have evidence for actually flexible working frees up some of that efficiency for us to think more about budget, program, health, safety, environment, the other things that sit on that list. Also, that flexible working helps us attract a different type of person. So when we were working outside Euston Station, offering different working hours for our traffic marshals or our customer experience representatives attracted more women to the position, but also we attracted a different type of person, people who actually used to work in the front of house or in retail, and which is really, really important when you're outside Euston and your operatives are engaging with a lot of different people coming from outside the station, so we could train them up. But the flexible working was something that enabled that. And so I'm really here to think specifically about how flexible working links to both remote working, so people's location, and also their hours that they are working as well too. I can talk in depth around that, and I'm sure there's going to be questions coming through, but happy to go into more of those details. The other thing I am really passionate about is, I think in construction, given that everything we do is meticulously planned, and we have a really good way of looking at kind of 1 week ahead, 2 week ahead, 6 weeks ahead, 12-week ahead when we're working on site, we need to be clear that flexible working in construction is quite a planned activity. It needs to be planned into how we're managing things, and we're good at planning, so we should be able to do that. And the other thing I think is essential is considering the contractual and commercial changes that are needed in our industry in order to think about this right at the start when we're tendering for work, or even when clients are putting work out there too. When I worked on High Speed 2, really fantastically is in our contract with them, they hadn't specified the working area that we could charge our time back to. So you didn't need to be in one specific office in order to charge your time back to working on High Speed 2. And that enabled us to really start to think about what flexible working is possible for location for those roles, where that is possible too. So I think that would be something we could talk about further as well too. So yeah, that's me for now. I'll hand you over to the other speaker, and we can chat more then.
Sorry, Alice, can I just jump in with a quick question just off the back of one of the points you raised there? The idea that, that sort of flexible working construction really needs to be a planned activity. Are there particular tools and processes that you think like sort of enable that from a site perspective that, you've seen work to effect?
Yep, definitely. So a couple of things spring to mind. Initially is to, when we do our 6 and 12-week look ahead on site, is to consider where in the program there's going to be pinch points. So when we need all hands on deck, everybody needs to be probably in the office working the set hours. And when there are times in the program where things are a little bit easier and gentler, in which case let's really drum in around flexible working, because in my experience, that's when people can catch up with that paperwork, their RAMS assessments, or their personal training that they need to do, or everything else that goes with building something too. So adding it into the look ahead is really critical. Thinking about it on a day-to-day kind of basis, that something that came out of us working in COVID was that we had 2 start of shift briefings happening every morning, because we couldn't get everybody into the same room because of social distancing. And given that you're generally not allowed to work on site that day unless you've been to that start of shift, it means that people have to be on site at 7:30. So the flex that's possible with time is very difficult if people want to do a school drop off, for example. Whereas having 2 start of shift briefings and having a workforce that maybe start early and finish a little bit earlier, and a workforce that start later and finish later in the day, meant that people could kind of choose which team they were working with, or we could rotate that around teams too. And even now, with technology where it's at, and again, this has been driven by the pandemic, even considering recording that start of shift briefing, so people that need to access sites later on in the day because they're coming even later, they can watch the start of shift briefing back, sign off that they've read it, and then that accommodates a little bit more flexible working as well too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I do have more questions for you, but let's hear from Angus first, and then we'll swing back.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks, Jordan. So my name's Angus Duggett. I'm the Commercial Director at HKS Architects. So we're obviously a US-owned but global architectural practice with multiple contracts across the globe. but I'm focused really on the Europe, Middle East, Africa region from our London office. I actually joined HKS in the middle of the pandemic, so was one of those people who went through the joys of trying to onboard myself remotely and the challenges that just sat around that. But previously I'd actually been on a live job, so I'd experienced many of the challenges which Alice has alluded to, and how we managed contractors and the to's and goes from site is something that echoes with us. But I really want to focus on what we did as an architectural practice, and I think most probably aligning with a lot of consultants, where I think it could be argued it was much easier for us to go and work from home because we don't have to dig any holes, we just have to draw them. So from that perspective, HKS in itself really adapted quite quickly. And actually drew upon something that they'd already been working on, which was called FWX, which was their flexible working experience. And they've been looking at flexible working mainly from how we used our office space in the run-up to the effects of the pandemic. So in many ways, we were already slightly set for it. And the key underpinning of that was actually surveying the staff on a weekly basis to look at how their workload and how their weekly approach to work was impacted, benefited by, and also negatively in terms of that home working. And as I say, we'd already been looking at as a principle for how we made our offices operate. So obviously with the advent of the COVID and lockdowns, we had to look at how we used our office space most effectively, but also how we kept people's morale and well-being was a core focus of that aspect. And obviously we picked up early on key things like allow people to manage some of their work around things such as childcare, particularly when schools were shut. So those people who had that challenge of homeschooling plus delivering their outputs for work. So we looked at that. But we also took a view also on those who were maybe living in multiple living situations where maybe they were having to work out of their bedroom, or 4 of them working around a kitchen table. So again, how could we make that work and adopt a better position for them, and also ensuring just those simple things of making sure people had the right equipment in order to carry out their work. Again, as everyone knows, anyone that works in architecture engineering, IT requirements can be quite heavy now in terms of the amount of computing power that's required. So again, making sure that we got the correct equipment out to people to allow them to deliver their work. So these are all standard things that I think people went through. But I think one of the things that we also really wanted to be keen to look at was how this is a very collaborative business. And a lot of learning comes from sitting within teams, sitting around, watching people sketch, red line drawings, mark up, pin ups on walls, so on and so forth. And obviously that disappeared for a while and became much more challenging. And also drew in a level of, weirdly, one of the things that came through our analysis of flexible working was that actually when we're all working at home, it actually became less flexible, because suddenly your life became structured around Teams and Zoom calls, rather than just popping over to somebody's desk and having a chat and pulling a drawing out and looking at an issue and maybe getting a client or a contractor on the phone and having that discussion. So again, how do we adapt to that? Well, we use products such as Miro, because again, we continue to work with our clients on a global scale, and we're doing markups and SketchUps with them live. It had its moments, like all IT was tested to the limits at times. But I think what we noticed was that everyone adapted to that way of working, accepting that in certain ways it was never going to be perfect. But I think also as a business, we realized that actually opened up a much wider scope of our services within our own business. So people were talking to each other, talking to colleagues in the US who maybe they hadn't been engaged with, certainly who they hadn't seen before. So again, it opened up this wider group. But conversely, people actually felt more detached from their local work colleagues because obviously they weren't seeing them as often. In terms of, therefore, as things moved on, we obviously started to try and get people back or give people the option, should I say, to come back into the office as early as we could and as early as the rules would allow. And as I say, making that an option, not forcing people. Obviously, a lot of people's concerns were around transportation, particularly use of public transport in London and those kinds of things. But what we did within the office was just create a basis where we could create space, but still create that collaborative feel. So we didn't put up screens between desks, but what we did do was spread desks out and take chairs away so that people were naturally operating on that level. And people weren't shouting across the office at one another, but obviously understood to keep a respectful and reasonable distance. But what we were keen to do was maintain that studio feel and that access to the studio. And interestingly, clients were very keen as soon as they could travel again to come to London or to have the teams move, to go out and look at sites and present to them and get that feel for jobs, because we all know you never really get the proper feel for a job unless you're physically there seeing it and touching it and feeling it. But again, going back to a point I made earlier, we're obviously very focused on the fact that we have young members of staff who are still in their developmental phases of their careers, and actually a lot of what they pick up is just from that interaction with colleagues and senior staff and their mentors. So again, a drive to keep the younger staff, particularly those on Part 2 and Part 3 courses for their qualification, to get them coming in. And ensuring that they, we create a specific time for them, whether that again be online, but also looking as much as we could to do face-to-face aspects. And I think similarly, just again from the office perspective, that gave rise to how we delivered certain elements of our work. So again, we've created specific areas where specific work will be done, such as our modelling. Any visualizations we do have specific areas within the office. So again, people know that that's the area where they go and work. And that again, just saves people taking up desks, sitting in each other's spaces, so on and so forth. That flexibility has certainly been adopted. But it's been, I think, a very interesting process, but also I think pointed out to us that actually when it hit initially, and I found this in my other job, we're actually quite well set up for it to start with. Doing work overseas, we've got used to the fact that we don't physically sit with our clients all the time. So, again, use of video conferencing, use of online tools has become much more prevalent over the last few years. So I think in many ways, it was just an extension of a number of processes that we were already operating by, which again, clients have adopted. But I think the interesting thing, I think in summation at this point, is it'll be very interesting, because we've talked a lot about how, what the new normal is, and that's a phrase that's been kicked around a lot, and how we'll operate as a business going forward. But I think the reality is a lot of that will be driven by our clients and how our clients want to operate. And a lot of our clients are already, I think, moving to the previous normal way of working. We have a big client meeting today with people from 3 different countries here. So, I think there is that drive to bring people back in and people wanting to have that face-to-face interaction. So I think it'll be a balance between what we see benefits as a business, but ultimately, meeting our clients' wants and needs. And on that, I will leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a great overview to start things off. I think the first question, I'm actually going to be cheeky and throw in one of my own. One of the key things that I think, obviously in those opening presentations, you've both raised some of the challenges, but also the opportunities presented from having different, and not one size fits all approach to the idea of flexible working. How do you go about practically enabling that? Are there specific, even from a logistical tool perspective, are there things that firms who are looking at that and being yeah, that's what we want to be able to implement this on site or within our business? Or are there things that they should be implementing? Are there tools? Are there systems? Are there those sorts of technical aspects that could help someone sort of follow the lead that you guys are laying out here? Mm-hmm. Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, I don't mind. I can start. Yeah, sure. So I think having worked on site for 5 years and now sitting in a position where I guess I set the policy for Skanska UK as a whole, I see it from both sides. On the one hand, you want a policy that is really enabling and supportive of your company's line towards flexible working, but also what your employees are looking for as well too. And I think the pandemic has really shown us that flexible working is not just something for people who have children. We have people working flexibly within Skanska because they're studying, because they're training for a marathon, because they simply want to have more time to themselves at the weekend. And one of the good things I think in our policy is that we differentiate between formal and informal flexible working. And the informal piece is something that's very team specific, is generally discussed more locally. It might be on Tuesdays, I'm going to start work at 10:30, and if I'm absolutely needed at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, yes, I can make arrangements around it, but that's generally my preference, compared with the formal route, which is a change to your contractual terms and conditions too. And the reason I stress that is because I think particularly on sites, it has to be something that's locally agreed, that's appropriate to the team. And one of the tools that I found useful and has gained a lot of traction with people is getting teams to think about Monday to Friday, what are the general tasks that we have to do as a team on site, what are the general tasks we have to do as individuals, and which of those are more suited to doing in the office or on the site, and which of those are more suited to doing away from the office or the site. And that gives you an indication of how people can be most effective and efficient when they are in together, and what flex is possible if they want some quieter space whilst at home. And things like Angus mentioned, if you're doing really big number crunching, you probably need like a really solid Wi-Fi connection, which you might get better on site. Whereas if you're doing something really technical and reviewing things, you need some quiet, maybe it's better to do that remotely too. But my key point here is that your policy has to have kind of the agility within it to enable teams on sites, or teams building stuff, or teams having a lull in their program to decide what's right for them and review it probably on a quarterly basis. I think that's absolutely critical for us to balance people who need to be on site digging the hole and people who can have a little bit more flex too.
Brilliant. Angus?
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I think also one of the things we all noted was, sorry, there's somebody drilling, so classic. I think we adopted a management style, and looking at how we adjusted our management style, and something one of our hospitality team did, which they're still doing, was a 9 a.m. call for half an hour, where actually they just focused on people, not on work, didn't talk about projects. Somebody presented something about themselves, what they were cooking that weekend or whatever, but a very much a very focused on the key thing was to get the people communicating, because I think that was also a reaction to the fact that people found very quickly that they were on log jams of 10 hours of Teams calls every day, just constantly talking about work, and it was a constant grind. So, and I think the general feedback and tone and engagement with those gave us a strong feeling of the well-being side of it. And I think that's kind of something that's I think it's quite easy for people to fall into that. Oh, this is quite nice because I don't have to commute, but actually there's a whole load of other engagement elements, just being around people that are positives that come out of coming to work, and ensuring that I think those are promoted is key. I think also, just from a slightly tangential view, but from a commercial point of view, but going back again to, I think, something that Alice picked up on, when this first hit, we all have force majeure clauses in contracts, and to be blunt, no one ever thinks we're going to have to use them. And we went through that process of very much, I think a lot of people, and I did it when I arrived at HKS, was just scrubbing any standard agreements that we had, what that actually meant, because we'd actually gone through the process of going, actually we'd have had a pandemic, which is normally covered by that, but actually because of the specific rules that were brought in, wasn't actually boilerplate. And I know on my previous job, I spent pretty much 3 months working out how we were doing that, ensuring that we could reasonably compensate contractors, but also, again, supporting the fact that they were having to move to a more flexible model, and normal contractual terms and approaches wouldn't actually work. They were going to either become punitive or too difficult to deal with. So I do think there's a number of points where you kind of out of the back of what we've been, through the last couple of years. It's allowed us maybe to look at some of our, our internal processes, but also our commercial approach to how we deliver work, and making sure that, our agreements and what have you are fit for purpose to reflect, the desire and maybe need to go to a more flexible way of working.
Can I add to that?
I was going to say that was something that you touched on there, the contractual side of things as well. So I was going to say, is there anything else you want to add to that before I move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think I mentioned about the contractual side of things. We're working with people who are hourly paid, or people who are tied to only being able to earn their salary when they're tied to a location. And removing that tie to a location has been fantastic for our workforce that can work remotely some of the week. But also, I mean, this is a huge shift for the industry, but considering what flex is possible with those that are hourly paid, do we start to look more into an output-based model? Do we look at paying people based on shifts? They're huge questions, and probably quite scary questions for somebody like Angus, who's managing commercial sides of things, because there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot more uncertainty there. But I do believe that for construction to help solve its skills gap and recruit more people going forward, that's something we've got to consider, and we're not the only industry to have that issue. We partnered with an organisation called TimeWise, when was it, November 2020, to run some flexible working trials with operatives who were hourly paid and who were part of our supply chain. And there was things we got wrong because they didn't work. For example, where kind of informal agreements had been raised between the operatives and the supervisor to then add another layer just added too much complexity. So it's about keeping it simple. But there were also times when we agreed with the workforce that they could work longer hours, some days shorter hours, other days that at the end of the week their take-home pay was still the same. But we saw an improvement in their well-being. There was no impact on the program. There was no impact on health or safety. And sometimes I think we think, oh, we've got to do something to improve it. But actually the feedback that we had from the workers in terms of their well-being, if there's no impact on anything else, surely that's just a good thing, full stop. And it's something we're looking to replicate at other sites. I'll try and copy and paste the link to that case study that's available publicly for anybody that wants to read it. The other point, completely different, and I'm really glad you raised it, Angus, is working flexibly in construction does and will require a different style of leadership than we've had so far. The trust that you have to have in your team, that they're working and they're not sitting next to you, the ability to connect with people on quite a personal level with those check-ins that you mentioned, Angus. Also, on the flip side, you've got to have a difficult conversation if you think somebody does need to come into the office to do their job too. These are different skills that perhaps we haven't had to focus on as much because we can be so technically competent to be a leader in this industry too. And I think that's another shift that's going to be needed for us to keep pace with what other industries are doing.
Something that you sort of touched on there with that trial, and it's something that Angus mentioned at the other end of the scale, sort of, is the idea of, supply chain. There's the clients at one end and like the long tail of the construction supply chain. How do firms at different places in those supply chains go? It's obviously a challenge. If you're a smaller subcontractor, there's going to be more challenge offering that same flexibility as from a client who's pushing down a directive. Is there a sort of responsibility on client, if we want to see an actual transformation of the way construction works, as construction built environment firms work as a whole, is there somewhat of a reliance on clients to embrace that?
I think, my role was as a client. So, and I think, yeah, there is, but I think the key that happened, and one of the great things that happened at the start of the issue was, we were all in the same boat. So communication, which can sometimes be guarded, was no longer guarded because we're all trying to work out a solution. And I think that plays to, a wider aspect, which I think people have always said, certainly in my 25 years in construction, communication needs to be clearer and a bit more open. But I think it is about looking at, we went through an extensive piece of work to look at the size and nature of our supply chain, look at where the high risk areas were, look at those who, you know, because again, we obviously had to take account the fact that you were going to have potential large, you know, periods where labour might be sick across a, you know, huge number of people. So again, you know, how are smaller elements of the supply chain going to be affected by that? Looking at impacts of, you know, key suppliers maybe, you know, being delayed and what that would do. So I think trying to work through how the, you know, at the end of the day, it's a difficult, as Alice correctly says, for people like me, it's a really difficult balance to strike, because I've still got to manage the fact that I need to get performance, you know, out of an end product, but without trying to be too punitive, so that it became so difficult and actually starting to get into unnecessary additional challenges. So I think that communication down the supply chain to say, look, what is your position? And that was really what I spent the first 3 days doing, was phoning all of my supply chain and saying, what's your position, guys? You know, how you know, where are your risks and issues? Can we understand what those are? And I think also a slight kind of no blame culture started to appear, where we were trying not to, you know, say, you know, but what I was pushing was, but if there is an issue, you need to be open about it. You need to be clear and allow us to react to it. And I think that it's always a two-way street. But I do agree. I think that's set by the client. The client ultimately is the one who, you know, who takes the overall, is taking the overall risk, whether that be financial or what have you, at the front end. So I think they're very much need to set that, but also look at how they're contracting and the way in which the flexibility that can be adapted into that to make it work a little bit better. I know that, you know, flexibility in contracts creates grey areas, and, you know, there's a whole, again, myriad of things that come out the back of that. But I do think the key, as I said at the very start, is that communication element. You know, be open about the risk, be open about the challenges. And I think also when we're procuring now, you know, we're now looking at being asked about ESG, about our flexible working policies, about our wellness approach. You know, it's becoming, you know, key, not just with public sector clients, but I think private sector clients are seeing it again from that ESG side, you know, the benefits that's going to bring to their investment side. So I think, again, you know, that aspect, it hopefully that's going to start drawing it out earlier on, and therefore jobs, as always, will be built from that premise up, rather than it kind of being wedged in as an afterthought halfway through the process. So I think that's kind of, you know, the approach that will have to be taken, you know, as this kind of way of working is adopted more and more, because I think the genie's out of the bottle and it's going to be very difficult to put it back in.
Absolutely. Alice, did you have any thoughts on the supply chain question?
I don't know if I can add much to what Angus has already said. I really emphasize, I totally agree that how the client sets things up kind of influences how then the contractor sets things up, how the supply chain sets things up. And certainly on High Speed 2, having a client that had thought about it in the contract initially from day one, and actually when we went to them to say we want to do a flexible working trial with our supply chain, this is something really new, to have their backing and their support is absolutely critical, because we're working on behalf of High Speed 2. So yeah, I would totally agree there with what Angus has said.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to jump to an audience question now. So this is coming from one of our audience members, and it says, it is really good to hear positivity about flexible working in the sector, as so much of the discourse revolves around a push to get employees fully back into the office. Our audience member would be really interested in hearing your points of view on how to make the argument for flexible working within a business. Yeah. So is there any way, if someone is looking at their business and being like, how can I convince them that we should still be working flexibly? Mm-hmm. What would you, sort of the key areas that they should be hitting on?
Mm-hmm. I can start if you like. I mean, I don't know where to start, because there is so many benefits. But I think if you're thinking about the business case, I mean, consider what's important to your business or the project that you're working on, and try and narrow it down from there. So with my inclusion and diversity hat, flexible working ensures that we appeal to a much wider talent pool than we can at the moment. Obviously, working parents and particularly mothers returning to work who typically take the large proportion of childcare, massive. But also flexible working is really expected from both the younger members of our workforce and people towards the end of their careers, whether it's, you know, they're wanting to slow down before retirement, they're wanting to think about other things too. So there's an attraction piece there, and I think where that really sits with construction is, again, on High Speed 2 we needed 25,000 new people to join the industry to deliver the works. Those 25,000 people aren't free from other construction projects at the moment. They're not available, quite simply. So we have got to fish in other talent pools, and simply put, like, flexible working is just expected now, and it's something we need to offer. Thinking about it also from a productivity side of things. So if you're really clear about what you're coming into the office to do, and if you're working remotely, or when is the most appropriate time to do tasks, there is data out there that says that flexible working improved productivity. In fact, from the trials that we did pre-COVID, I think it was 67% of people said the main benefit for them was that flexible working enabled them to work more efficiently. They could decide, they had much more control over their diary, and they could allocate specific time to do tasks as well too. There's a cost saving to flexible working as well too, both for the individual, if you're looking at commuting tickets or what have you, train tickets, but also from an office space perspective. I would caveat that though with that you still need to have a really good office environment so that people, when they come to work, do, you know, have got the IT and the setup that they need, and they can collaborate in a really effective way. Maybe there's a different use of the space that you've got at the moment too. They're the things that spring to mind. I'm sure there's loads more other avenues. Angus, maybe you've got other bits to add.
Yeah, I think you've hit on the key things. I think that, you know, the widening of the talent pool, I think, is a big benefit, and I think also it's that adoption of how we work. I think, again, you know, I've spent 20+ years working mainly on an international platform, which is and actually having that in a slightly more formalized or recognized way of working, I think allows you potentially to operate in a better and more effective manner. I think, you know, particularly when, you know, although they have moved to Monday to Friday, when the Middle East works, you know, Sunday through Thursday, you know, that requirement, and I think moving away maybe from getting people to work 7 days a week and that side. I think also what it's allowed, and to the office space point, it's allowed us to manage ebbs and flows with one of those organizations which was, as I say, agile before we started. You know, we went through this kind of enforced process, so we already were working pretty tightly to numbers of heads and desks. And I think, again, you know, what we're tending to find is we get concentrations of teams coming in that are very focused on, you know, maybe one sector, or focus groups within that. And I think, again, that flexibility of working, that drawing in, then people going away and then coming back together. And I think also, to be frank, and it goes back to the point around time and cost, the amount of time that potentially is wasted coming into an office to go out to a meeting, to come back to an office, to go out to a meeting, when literally your meeting was potentially down the road from where you live, or, you know, those kinds of approaches. And I don't think, you know, most companies have been that rigid, but I think, you know, that aspect of people feeling the need to be in the office maybe for a morning, and then, you know, managing it, actually they can manage it more effectively. And I think ultimately we'll tell whether it works by client reaction. You know, back to the point Alice made about, you know, having to sit next to somebody to make sure they're doing their work. And I suppose I've always come from the school of thought that, well, people either deliver it or they don't, and you'll know if they're not, because it won't happen. So, you know, if there's a deadline, there's a deadline. I don't really care where you're delivering it from, as long as you hit the deadline and the quality that we need you to hit. So I think, again, it's, as I say, I think the area where there's just a little bit of risk is around that element of collaboration. Say maybe people getting to a point where slightly, I think those who start, I think the ones I feel for most, those who started their careers in, you know, during this phase, because I think almost knowing nothing else and actually trying to get them to say, well, actually come into the office, you know, because it's a good place to be, as I said, you know, creating that environment. So I think, again, just making sure that that culture hasn't stuck, and that we still have this, wanting to bring people together. And whether you do that, we seem to find that if we offer a social occasion, it's been very well attended. So always offer a beer and some pizza, and apparently everyone's happy to come in.
I can imagine. One of the questions we've had come in was, there's the tools that we all sort of the tools that we all talk about, the Zoom, Teams, WebEx, those sorts of tools. Are there any other particular digital systems, digital tools that you've seen implemented to facilitate better flexible working processes within your businesses?
I think from our side, Miro, this is basically this collaborative tool, which is almost like an online whiteboard, has been really good. And you can set up these Miro boards so that you can shape them around projects. I think being able to, adapting tools so that you can do things live on screen. So again, say SketchUps and that side of things. But Miro is definitely something that we've really embraced from a design and team perspective, and a benefit out of it, and ultimately just these huge whiteboards that you can then navigate around. And I think we're most really lucky from the design side that a lot of the tools were collaborative to start with. So again, it was more about computing, and I think, as Alice rightly says, Wi-Fi power was most really our biggest risk of the system actually just falling over itself. But that's certainly been a tool that I think has come to the fore. But I think also just online tools from us as a business, where we get our information from, where people would obviously, wander across somebody's desk in the office to ask a question. We updated our online tools to give people accessibility to information and data that maybe wasn't, that readily available. They had to mine for it a bit to make it a bit more front and center. So again, I think we saw it as an opportunity to to upgrade things like our intranet to really make sure that we were, people who were working remotely were not inconvenienced or otherwise because they weren't in the office, that it was actually quite an easy place to repository to get information from.
Absolutely. Alice, did you have anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think certainly for us, two things that our staff have fed back to us that they've really appreciated. One is very simple, depends on which side of the fence you sit on, but in the pulse surveys that we were doing in the height of the pandemic, people told us how much they appreciated additional communication. So the pandemic obviously made us get better at like publishing information, sharing it much more proactively rather than relying on people to sit next door to somebody and ask the question. And one of the things people really appreciated was our CEO Craig doing like a quarterly briefing from wherever he was working at the time, so his home initially, and now he's obviously back in the office for some days of the week too. But the feedback from that was phenomenal. People really liked hearing quite what's going on in Skanska, but also updates from our leader and our CEO as well, and other members of our leadership team too. And I think for me, that comes back to that shift in leadership that's needed, that transparency piece, that that real people-centric kind of focus. The other thing was around, and I mentioned kind of the tech that's on sites around the ability to film the start of shift briefing, but also for people that would normally be on site and initially at the start of the pandemic really weren't, and that was when we were in the height of lockdown and you literally couldn't go to site unless you were digging the hole, was using like drones and cameras on site to broadcast back to people what was going on. And actually since that, it's grown legs into, we have quite a lot of cohorts of junior leadership teams across the company who a kind of high potential talent, working very closely with our senior leadership team, and some of them do monthly vlogs from where they've been on site too. And again, it gives everybody an opportunity to see what's going on and get a high level overview. And if you want more detail, the drone fly throughs or the cameras that we've got on site will enable people to do that as well too.
Brilliant. No, they all sound like great innovations that we, other tools that add that extra layer of insight when you're not, physically able to be there. We've had another audience question come in that I'm going to put to you in the first instance, Angus, because it's along the lines of something that you've been talking about in terms of new starters and more junior members of staff. So our audience member said, I'm very worried about the newer members of staff in my team. I'm sitting with them now and we're the only ones here. I'm in my mid-30s, they're all in their early 20s, and our colleagues in their 40s and 50s are all working from home much more often than they are in the office. How do we compensate for that learning by osmosis from role models / inspiring older colleagues, stuff that just happened before?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. The reality is, I think a lot of the younger staff were those who are living in, multiple occupancy, houses and things like that. So as soon as we opened the office up, they were the people who were, to be frank, were keen to come in because it was just a much more conducive working environment. Yeah, I think there's an obligation on us as leaders, and we've been very clear on that with HKS. That we need to have that visibility, and that leadership is key to how those people grow, and that goes from the top down through associate level, through vice presidents, all levels of the business down to those more junior staff. So we've been very clear, around our leadership and looking, to them to commit and lead from the front to specific days when they're in. So as I said, where we have specific practices. So we have a number of practices here: hospitality, healthcare, education. Again, leading from the front to have the leader in, and then actually a lot of the team then follow, knowing that the senior members are going to be in, so they get that opportunity to have that collaboration. Or also we'll drive it around, project reviews. Nowadays, clients coming in, but certainly, reviews or crits on project. We have technical sessions. So again, we've really driven to have those done face to face rather than online, because we think there's more benefit to the people, particularly junior staff. They again have that face time. Talking about things from CDM to, I'm doing a commercial session on contracts this week. But again, that drives. So I think it's great, and we've created a structure where I wouldn't say we've forced people to come in, but it's that ownership of, at a project level, at a corporate level, where we can have those reasons for engagement and clear reasons for engagement. And what I think our view has been is that it's gently started to just gather more pace to become back to a new normal again, where we've got larger portions of the team just in here consistently, and that encouragement for the junior staff to come in. But I would agree, I don't think it's an uncommon problem at the moment, and I think that has just been the nature of the beast, unfortunately, with more senior staff potentially living, the likes of London, living outside of the city, having houses, all that kind of thing, and potentially that flexibility around family as well. So not just they're sitting in their pile in the Cotswolds. It's managing their families and that side of their lives has obviously become a lot more beneficial, flexibly working. So I think that is again one of the challenges that's come out the back of this, and will continue to that basis of flexible working.
Absolutely. Alice, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that one?
No, not really specifically. Yeah.
I've got plenty more questions coming in that I'm happy to work our way through so that we can try and get through as many as possible. I will just say now, we've had a few people asking. Yes, it will be available on demand within about 60 minutes of us wrapping up. So if you want to rewatch, if you think there's value, if you think this might be the way to convince your business to start allowing flexible working and you want to share the link with someone, feel free. It's the same link you've joined with now. So within about by 4 o'clock, it should all be up and running again. Another one of the questions we've had come in, we've actually had a couple around mental health and the idea with flexible working, and whether there's been any particularly successful initiatives or tools to manage that in like that virtual landscape when people aren't all in one place and you might not be able to have those like casual check-ins with people as easily. Are there any particular initiatives or tools that you've seen work well?
I can start here. I think flexible working obviously remote working can be very detrimental to our mental health in terms of feeling lonely and Zoom fatigue and overworking ourselves. But at the same time, not having flexible working could be very detrimental to our mental health. So I think it helps to sit on, like, to explore this on both sides of that. Angus, you mentioned earlier about teams structuring in time to just check in on their people. It's probably something we all did in the pandemic. I think I saw something recently that over 90% of people are not doing that anymore, yet we are still working remotely. Those check-ins are so essential. And I would suggest as well that if you're doing like socializing, coming back to the office, consider people's different perspectives. So for example, today I'm at a team event, and my boss won't mind me saying, but she put on some breakfast for us this morning, and several of our colleagues are celebrating Ramadan. That's not open to them, so it's up to, it's been up to us to say, okay, that's not going to happen, but we can do something different later on, once that's possible. But my point here is structuring that in and planning it in is absolutely essential. As well, we've also had specific, I'm sure this is like lots of other companies, but specific sessions from people either talking about their own mental health journeys or briefings about how to manage your mental health, whether it's supporting your sleep, whether it's managing change in your life, managing your time a little bit more effectively. All of that helps too. And I think the final thing I would say is making sure that managers have like quite an open door to discuss this, because you can put all of these like support measures in place, but actually there just might need to be a change to somebody's role and their responsibilities. And you need to be in a place where that level of transparency is received in a good way, in a quite a mindful way. Obviously there's business priorities that need to be delivered, but that's not going to happen if everyone burns out after 6 months. And being really transparent about having that conversation.
Absolutely. Angus, did you have anything else that you wanted to add there?
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it is continuing that communication, and ensuring that people feel the comfort that they can, come and have those conversations and that side of it, and ensuring that. I think also the other thing about remote working to some degree is the ability to slightly put something in your in tray and then walk away from it. And I think, again, just making sure, I think with us as, at leadership, we've got to just make sure that, if we need actions to happen, that they happen.
Absolutely. We've had another question come in about the idea of presenteeism, and that traditionally in built environment companies, there has been a culture of presenteeism. You're seen to be working hard, or you'll progress if your face is there, and how that looks in a flexible landscape. Does it mean that people are overcommitting, feeling like they've got to respond to emails, Teams messages, no matter what time those come through? Is there a way, do you think that culture is shifting, and do you think there is more that needs to be done?
I think from our side, there's always been a level of that, and I think that responsiveness. But again, that's, I think, also come through, clients and where they're based in the world. If somebody, I worked for another large American organisation where I ran the Middle East, so my day started at 5 and finished at midnight. And that, I think, actually some of flexible working has moved away from that, because I think at times there's not an expectation that you are going to be there, because you might be off doing something else, within that flexible sphere. So I don't think it's ever going to stop people from wanting an immediate response. The one thing that I haven't noted, and I spoke to somebody about it this morning, I was using that novel invention called the telephone. And I said, this is quite strange, because I'm actually speaking to you on a phone whilst I walk along, and on a wait until I get into the office to do a Zoom or a Teams call. So I think, again, that aspect, and a lot of what I remember doing when you were allowed to have your momentary elements of exercise was I'd actually catch up on phone calls and get away from a screen. So I think, again, that's the whole point of flexible working, this demonstration we can do things in other ways through other modes, but some of them are things, again, that have been around for years, a telephone. But allowing that to fit in around people's day is again, I think, a key part of it.
Absolutely. I do love the phone while walking. I think it's a great way of catching up on things. Alice, did you have any other thoughts there?
Yeah, presenteeism is definitely still alive and present, I would say, unfortunately. I think just looking at the press this week of Jacob Rees-Mogg saying all civil servants have got to be back in the office 5 days a week, and that kind of assumption, and well, what have we all been doing for 2 years? And I'd really like to see the data behind, you know, what levels of productivity have fallen off a cliff in order to justify people going back in 5 days a week. But for me, a massive bit of this is that leaders have got to practice what they're preaching here. And senior leadership teams have also got to recognise the shadow that they're casting as leaders if they're talking to their team that flexible working is possible, but they themselves aren't working in a flexible way, whether that be remotely, whether that be with different start and finish times too. You know, what you do says a lot more than the words that you speak, and I think there has to be that inward reflection from leaders in our industry if they're serious about doing things differently to adopt those behaviours themselves. On a slightly different tact as well, this comes down to people having really clear and concise objectives, whether they're set in your annual review, whether they're set as like part of a quarterly basis or just with the project you're doing. If it's not written down somewhere what it is that you're expected to deliver, the argument can always be presenteeism or you know, somebody not performing too. And yeah, being transparent about those objectives is really, really key as well too.
Okay, brilliant. So we're nearly out of time, and I've got a few little admin things I've got to do at the end. So I'm going to ask you both a question now, but I'm going to then run through some of the admin and come back to you for the answer because I don't want to put you too much on the spot. I'd just love you both to sort of lay out your 1 or 2 big takeaways that you would have for people on this topic. What are the 2 or 1 or 2 things that everyone should be, you know, across? From my point of view, I just want to say huge thanks to the panel. It's been great. Also, huge thanks to our audience for being so engaged. We really want to hear your feedback as well as audience members. There is a brief survey, and I do mean brief, it's 3 questions, will take 90 seconds, that will pop up when this concludes. So if you could be so kind as to fill that in, we'd really love your feedback on other topics you want us to explore, things you want us to talk about with industry leaders such as Alice and Angus. So to you guys, what sort of things do you think, if everyone was going to walk away with a couple of things from this, what would you want it to be? Alice, I hit you up first, so I'll do it again.
Yeah, no problem. So a quote that really sticks in my mind is from the ex-head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at High Speed 2, and he used to say, Mark Lomas is his name, and he used to say, if we can build something that's going to be seen from space, i.e. High Speed 2, why can't we do it with flexible working? Like the complexity of what we deliver on a day-to-day basis and the planning and engineering and problem solving that goes into like our product as an industry means that we are more than possible to consider flexible working. And my main point there is that this does require a slightly different way of thinking, a slightly different leadership style, and it's up to us all to kind of embrace that. And it's really up to clients as well to set their cards on the table with what is and isn't possible, and to challenge themselves and maybe invite contractors into those decisions to think about where flexible working can sit there too, because like leaders, they set the precedent for what is and isn't acceptable.
Sorry, I know that was meant to be last thoughts, but that just raised an interesting question for me. How much is early engagement in setting that tone, like in terms of engaging with your supply chain to enable flexible working? Does the client need to be doing that early?
Hugely. Like I cannot overstate it. I think it's hugely important. It sets the tone for the rest of the project, not only with flexible working, but collaboration or appetite to risk, or in my world, like what is our ambitions around diversity and inclusion, what is realistic to. It is absolutely essential, the earlier contractor involvement.
Brilliant, thank you. And Angus, over to you.
I think just 2 things, and I think, you know, it touches on many things that have been said. I think the key is clarity, create clarity in the situation, you know, to exactly what Alice said, you know, what are the objectives, how does it work? You know, it has to be adaptable, but, you know, flexibility needs clarity, otherwise it's not flexible. So, you know, create that clarity up front, ensure everyone understands, and then, you know, once you've created that clarity, ensure it's communicated. So that communication, say, going back to, you know, those early days, the key to getting anything done was clear communication and open communication with people. So, you know, the flexible working is a policy. Unless it, you know, the application is correct, it is just a policy. It's a piece of paper. So, you know, it's about that application is key. And as I say, that really comes through creating clarity and then communicating it well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to both of you. Cannot thank you enough for being so generous with your time and expertise. We really appreciate it. It's been a great end to our Digital Building Series event today, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. So huge thank you to you. I'd also love to say a huge thank you to our audience for being so engaged, sending through some great questions. I have shared that link that Alice meant to the entire audience, so you can all check out that case study as well. If you enjoyed this session and want to explore if you missed the earlier ones, they're all available on demand on all three of our websites at the moment. That's Building, Building Design, and Housing Today. So I'd love to say,
hey, council tax.
That's my Alexa sending me a reminder. Apologies. But I'm just going to sign off now. So thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Jordan and Angus. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.